years ago, I was telling a friend of mine, another lawyer, about an innovative project using art and restorative justice to respond to intimate partner violence. Instead of going to the police or using the courts, people could use this alternative approach. And when I said this, my friend grimaced. And then he said, well, this being the criminal legal system, this is how it's always been done. I nearly fell over. And to be fair to my friend, he immediately realized that he was making a historically and geographically global statement without any real basis. And he walked it back real quick. But the moment stayed with me. And it stayed with me because that moment, that immediate knee-jerk response, is such a common response in so many of the conversations I have about justice. We cannot imagine an alternative response to harm because it feels like the way we have been doing things, the way we have been responding to harm, is the only way. We are so mired in the current system that our immediate instinct is to push back against any alternative. We didn't get here on our own. We were trained up this way. In this country, from the time you are young, popular media teaches you that law and justice look a certain way. There are the obvious examples, the incredible amount of television and film about policing and criminal trials. But there are less obvious examples as well. TV shows from He-Man to Star Trek seek to impart lessons in all aspects of law, from rule of law and governance to what constitutes an acceptable contract. And if you go to law school, like I did, then you are even more entrenched in the system. And I was. I'm a law professor at the University of South Carolina, with a background in international human rights. And for a long time, when I thought about problems of violence, particularly gender-based violence, I immediately thought about how to get the state to step in. In the international human rights system that I was trained in, criminalization was a key recommendation to respond to certain problems of violence. But it was hard to look away from the harms that were being committed by the very criminal legal system we were looking to for protection. In the United States, criminal policies disproportionately impact young Black men from lower income neighborhoods. Communities of color, LGBTQIA communities, and certain immigrant groups, among others, report negative experiences with police and courts, even when they're the ones reporting the harm. People who have been convicted of a crime have difficulty finding housing or employment, even after serving their time and repaying their debt to society, so to speak. But what about the victims, you might ask? The criminal legal system is not built to help victims. In 2016, the Alliance for Safety and Justice published the first ever national survey on victims' views on safety and justice. And according to this survey, 2 out of 3 crime victims did not receive any support to help them recover from the impacts of being victimized. Of those who did receive support, the majority received it from friends, family, or hospitals, not the criminal legal system. The survey also reported that a significant majority of victims actually prefer alternatives to punishment and incarceration. Yet, even knowing all this, people still argue in favor of a punitive criminal legal response. It is hard to imagine another way. Remember that friend I was telling you about, the one who was struggling with the idea of restorative justice? He, like many others, couldn't imagine another way. He couldn't imagine using restorative justice, a non-punitive approach, to respond to problems of intimate partner violence. let me back up for a minute. What is restorative justice? Well, there's no single model. Commonly, in response to a harm, restorative justice will bring together the people who have been harmed, the people who have committed the harm, and community stakeholders. Conversations will include in-depth discussion of the harm that's been committed and its impacts. In the criminal system, a person's testimony can be limited by rules of evidence or a lawyer's strategy about how to tell the story of what happened. Restorative justice, on the other hand, delves fully into what happened. The intended outcome is accountability. Accountability requires the responsible party to acknowledge the harm that they've committed and its impacts, to make appropriate reparation to the people they've harmed, and to take steps to ensure that they won't do it again. Restorative justice asks us to shift away from a focus on punishment and instead focus on arriving at real accountability. I used to be quite skeptical of restorative justice, but I've since come around to it. Well, I've more than come around to it. I really believe in it. In addition to being a law professor, I am the executive director and founder of the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. Our mission is to promote education and dialogue about restorative and transformative justice, and to support the development of restorative practices in South Carolina. Restorative justice is now a significant part of my work. Interest in restorative justice has been growing, and that's exciting, right? People will learn about restorative justice, they'll incorporate it into their work, and I'll be happy. Job done. Not quite. I've noticed that even as acceptance in restorative justice has been growing, so much of that new acceptance continues to anchor itself in the idea of the retributive criminal legal system as the primary default response. For example, when people talk about restorative justice, so many of them speak only of healing and forgiveness. I can recall one particular documentary film about restorative justice, which highlights the case of a woman who not only forgives the young man who killed her son, she embraces him. She welcomes him into her life and calls him her son. He calls her his second mom. And it's beautiful, it's very moving, but it's sold as the story of restorative justice. Not by any of the practitioners I've met who are very frank and down to earth about their work, but among mainstream audiences, so much of the storytelling around restorative justice focuses on these larger-than-life individuals. In this narrative, it is easy to perceive restorative justice as something that's only available to a small group of people who are special enough to participate in it. Restorative justice becomes this magical exception, and the criminal legal system is treated as the justice inevitability. It doesn't stop there. I've been having conversations with people all around the country who are interested in learning more about how to support and implement restorative practices in their communities. And a good number, not all, but a good number of them only want to hear about restorative justice in the context of juvenile justice, or face-to-face dialogue with people who are incarcerated, or as a diversion program that's attached to courts. Even though we have examples of other types of restorative practices right here in the United States. And look, I'll support any move to a more restorative approach, but the fact is, it is easy to reach for those three options because they do not require you to reevaluate the existing system. If you can only imagine restorative justice working for people who are under the age of 18 or who are already incarcerated or as an outgrowth of a criminal process, then you are limiting what restorative justice can be. And you continue to elevate the punitive criminal legal system as the default. But we are not bound to the carceral state. We are not limited to the existing criminal legal enterprise. The criminal legal system does not have to be the default. Restorative justice can be for everyone, for angry people, for impatient people, old people, young people, and people who have committed multiple types of harms. We can look to historical and comparative examples for support. For example, in Uganda, many traditional justice institutions use practices and principles that we see today reflected in the modern American restorative justice movement. Specific practices vary across clan or tribal group, but generally, when a harm has been committed, some form of reparation is offered to the person who has been harmed, and the community is responsible for educating the responsible party and helping them change their behavior. Today, we see these practices used in regular, everyday justice in a process called reconciliation. And I have met multiple practitioners who use reconciliation to address cases of domestic violence. This practice is not limited to juveniles, it doesn't relate to incarceration, and it can occur completely outside the courts. This practice is not limited to a special group of angerless individuals with hearts bigger than the universe. In fact, I can think of one example, a case in which a woman and her partner entered into a process to resolve the violence that she was suffering at his hands. Not only did she openly and freely express her anger, but at the end of the process, as a part of his accountability agreement, her partner agreed that he would stay away from her and that they would end their relationship. The process still offered both parties what they wanted and needed: an opportunity to speak their truths, to ensure that appropriate reparations were made, and to have a plan for the future that worked for the both of them and the community. I don't romanticize these processes. They can perpetuate harm. In the case of gender-based violence, they can, and at times have, reinforced harmful patriarchal norms. But this process offers an approach to resolving disputes in a way that can work better for the parties involved, and that also seeks to change future behavior. Uganda is just one example. Other examples exist elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, and among various indigenous groups in the Americas, to name a few. And what these examples reveal is that the American legal system's response to harm is not an inevitable result of the human condition. Other approaches have existed and continue to exist. As we seek to incorporate restorative principles, we do not need to anchor them in our system's punitive justice experiment. There can be another way. Restorative justice might not even be the final answer. There might be an even better way. But we will never get there if we do not give ourselves the freedom to more openly embrace new approaches to justice. Thank you.